Now we open up. Remember, this is not just a Q&A session. It wants just to open up the discussion to the many people that have great experience to bring in or great ideas they want to propose, and now it's the opportunity to do so. So please, we have 2 microphones again on the 2 sides, and you're just very welcome to cue on either of them. That side seems to be favored at the moment, but
Yeah, hello. I first would like to introduce myself. I'm Ulrich Schimmer, professor in psychology. But about a year ago, I started blogging under the pseudonym Dr. R, and I created the Replicability Index blog, so you can check that out. And that's where my kind of comments are coming out of psychology. And Daniele ranked us at the bottom of the hierarchy of sciences because we publish only things that work out. We never have failed studies, basically, in our journals. But that's kind of unfair, because maybe we just really know what we are predicting. We have good theories, and we're doing good studies. And so why should we be at the bottom of the hierarchy if we're getting so many significant results? Per se, that's not a problem. It's only a problem if, in the end, of course, these results are not replicable. And that leads us to John Krosnick's talk, where we heard that 36% of results that were significant and published in the top journals didn't replicate. So really, suddenly, our real power to predict things and make things work out is not 95%, but only 36%, which is pretty bad, right? But we're realizing now that the key issue, how we can evaluate science, and when we look at a paper and we say, should this be published or not, is really to know, can this be replicated? But often when we see a paper, we kind of know, well, how would we know? It's p smaller 0.05. So what more can we say? We have to trust the person. But that's where really developments in statistics have really pushed things forward. And that leads me to John Ioannidis and Greg Francis, who's not here, but who used John Ioannidis' test on articles published, for example, in Science, leads me to the journal Science now, and found that at least psychology papers, which often publish not just one study, but to demonstrate that we really can produce this effect, 2 or 3 or 4 studies. And looking at these 4 study papers in psychology, virtually everyone showed signs of questionable research practices. And this can't be publication bias, because these are 4 studies all in the same paper by the same authors, saying, look, this is all highly replicable, when in fact, the real question is just how many attempts did they need to produce those 4 studies? And that's what Stirling pointed out in 1959. The real unknown is usually, how many studies were needed to produce these effects.
Forgive me, I have to ask you to wrap up your own.
Right, and so the question for people who are in the business of peer review is, why are we not using statistical tools? And myself, I've developed a tool where you only need 2 p-values, and you can say, this is not questionable, this should not be published as is. We need stronger evidence, at least. The author should do a pre-registered study. Why we are still publishing papers that, with simple statistical tools, we already know, are not credible and will not replicate, at least replicated exactly as they were presented.
Okay, thank you very much. I would have a quick answer about obviously about the hierarchy. I partially agree with you, but we can talk about that later on. If you please on this side.
Okay, my name is Anders Wittfeldt. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at Metrics. So my question is about how we conduct the scientific discussion, because the way I see it, science is a process whereby we as a community try to reach agreement about what we believe about the world and how certain we are about those beliefs. That's what we're doing with science. And it used to be that the most efficient way to have that conversation was to send your paper to the Royal Proceedings of Science or something like that, because that was the technology that was available. It was a slow process, and every time you published something, you had to be completely sure it was right, because otherwise it would be like correcting it would take years, months. So you wanted to do this peer review thing on those things that were sent in before you published it in a way that was going to be permanent, and in a way that was in the slow publishing system that we used to have. We now have new technology. We have the internet. We have the ability to publish things on our own website. And we can have the scientific discussion without peer review and without publishing houses, without any dependence on the system that has so many flaws. So is there any reason other than historical reasons why we keep using this model of science, using using publishers. Why do we need that to conduct a scientific discussion in 2015? That's my question for the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to suggest that we take 3 or more, so that maybe, there might be some overlap, hopefully, and if you keep track of what you want to say, then we'll open up the discussion again. Thank you on this side.
Marissa Lasser from Sydney, Australia. My question goes to the issue of blinded peer review. I'm a very strong believer that peer review should be an open process, and that not only should the review be open in terms of back to the authors, but the review process should also be published along with the actual paper somewhere on the website. And there are certainly journals that do that already. And I don't know what sort of evidence one would need to have to determine whether that would be a better process for science versus the blinded process that is the majority of journals these days. But one of the things I was going to suggest, that if the peer review process was open, it's possible the authors may be more willing to then share their code or share their data, because they know with whom they're having their conversation. So that certainly would be, one advantage among many, I would say, with having an open process.
Thank you very much. We'll take the first group of questions on this side.
Hi, Sean Grant from RAND Corporation. Thank you for the excellent presentations. It's an honor to be here. My comment, which I welcome any responses from anyone on the panel, is sparked by John's comment about the need for causal models of scientific behavior. And the comment I'd like to pose is that I think our solutions that we're proposing are really interventions. They're behavioral or policy interventions, so much like in psychology or other disciplines. They're conscious and purposeful actions, techniques, or strategies with hypothesized mechanisms of action to change behavior in the scientific community. So could we import models from that area, like the MRC framework for complex interventions, to formulate theory and evidence-based interventions, test whether they work before we implement them on a wide scale, and then use insights from implementation science? And maybe to use an example to contextualize this, Brian's silly or stupid badges, I can't remember how he described them. If they're working, which he showed with data, or Equator has showed with the reporting guideline interventions, is it a mechanism of action of rewarding those who do it, and that's what incentivizes people, or are people doing it out of fear that they're going to be shamed if they don't have that badge, and examining the ways that we could really make these solutions be sustainable and widespread? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, very early, so there's a suggestion about why are we using outdated statistical tools? Isn't the model of scientific publishing outdated altogether? And related to that, why not hone in more on open peer review? And how about using behavioral interventions from psychology to ameliorate our practices? So, who should I go first?
I can jump in on the first 2 questions. Why publish? Why not go immediately just to preprint servers? There are a number of communities that do use preprint servers and use them quite effectively. Those communities use preprint servers often as a way to vet ideas prior to going to formal publication, and they find that that's a good way to find out which ideas are worth going on to publication and getting feedback from the community. I would say one of the problems with only relying on preprint servers is that right now, with the volume of papers that are being published, I think in 2014, 1 million papers in science were published. And of those 1 million papers, the majority of them were cited 0 times. And so the problem is, most of them get some kind of constructive feedback thanks to an editor asking reviewers to take a look at the paper and doing something to vet that paper to find out, is it technically correct, and is it worthy of having the imprimatur of that journal? And so the problem with going entirely to preprint servers, as the way to move the science forward is that the majority of the papers probably are not going to get read and are not going to be constructively improved or get any kind of imprimatur from anyone as to whether the paper is of any kind of quality. And so it's going to be very difficult, particularly for young researchers and young students, to know whether they can trust the literature. And so we've been discussing a lot about how we still need to worry about whether the literature can be trusted. And as journals, we need to do more to increase that trust factor. But with preprint servers, there's going to be no trust factor because so many of them won't even be read. To the second question about open peer reviewers, I just want to make 2 points. One was the point that Drummond made about how we need to have some kind of science of the science of peer review. I think many more journals would feel more comfortable about going to open peer review if we had some kind of statistics, analysis, some kind of results that would show us that it is at least as good, if not superior, to the current half-blind peer review, because the last thing we want to do is make peer review any worse. The other point I'll make is right now, I'm not sure if any of you have been following the news, but one of our papers from Science is in the midst of a huge battle at Congress where one of our authors is being FOIA'd by a congressional committee. The head of the agency, the head of science, and the authors are being hauled in front of Congress. All their emails are being subpoenaed, and all of the correspondence with science is being laid bare before Congress, demanding why was this climate change paper published in Science, and all of those details. Fortunately, because Science's peer review process is confidential, the names of those peer reviewers will never be released, and we would go to the Supreme Court to protect those identities. If we did not have a blind peer review, those peer reviewers would be hauled in front of Congress too, and you can bet on it.
Thank you very much. I have to remind us, because again, apologies once more, we have to keep it brief, although, well, actually, yeah, you had right to more time than other speakers.
I'd just like to ask the question, we get much fewer people interested in having us reveal the names of the reviewers on our, of course we get people who want to know the names of reviewers, and my perception is that reviewers would be more reluctant to reveal their names since money is involved. But I'd like to hear if anyone has any evidence that doing this in an open way for NIH review would be helpful.
Well, there's plenty of evidence that journals that have adopted review where the reviewer's name is open to the author, the sky doesn't fall, they don't get into trouble. One of them is the British Medical Journal. That's been tried. There are many others. So on the one hand, you have journals that don't have trouble and tried, and the others, the rest, who do or do not have trouble too. And of course, I like it, because though none of my co-editors, they all think I'm nuts on this one, and that's correct. And I'm hidden by this, and we've gone to court at least 5 times to sustain the privacy of the system, and won each time. And other journals have also. It's going to be I'm very interested to know how your case is going to work out.
John, Professor Krosnick, maybe I should say, but nothing. What about the behavioral interventions? Because some of your data would suggest that, yeah? But wouldn't some of your conclusions suggest that maybe they can't work as well?
I completely endorse. In fact, that's kind of the spirit of my thinking, is that all of the proposals that are on the table for ways to improve scientific practice are hypotheses about what might improve scientific practice. And so, for example, I'm a huge fan of transparency. I'm a huge fan of pre-registration, and I'm a huge fan of archiving and making data public. But I know what the benefits are of them that make me enthusiastic, and they are immediate right now for my own research team by doing it all. I don't have any confidence that building a gigantic mountain of public data will lead to reanalysis of those data in a way that will improve scientific practice in the long run. That's a hypothesis. It might be, and it might not be. And so I would like to see that tested.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's get more questions, please, on this side.
Doug Altman from Oxford. There are hundreds, many hundreds of reviews of publications that show that methodological errors and inadequate reporting are the norm. All of these reviews are reviews of peer-reviewed publications. It's not that peer review is not, peer review is not working, and I think we need to also to consider what instructions peer reviewers are given and what training they're given. And in fact, most of them get no training. They don't know, how can it be that, for example, just to give you a specific example, the strength of a randomized trial is the fact it's randomized. The majority of reports of randomized trials don't tell you how they did that. Hundreds of reviews, literally hundreds of reviews have found the same thing. That key piece of information is usually missing. These are all peer reviewed. We should also look at the usability of papers, not just the reproducibility, but the usability. In one field I work on in prognostic research, a high proportion of regression equations which are published to predict outcomes in patients are not usable because they don't publish the intercept for the regression equation. That's basic, simple stuff. So we need to think about training peer reviewers and targeting their activities on the strength of the science and the usability of the report.
Okay, thank you very much. This side.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Rajendran from the University of Zurich. This is regarding the fantastic talk by Dr. McMahon. You mentioned that you're now going to implement, or you suggest that you could upvote the protocols published in Science, or people could vote post-publication articles that are published in Science. It's a fascinating idea. I think I'm a proponent of post-publication review, but it somehow looks like it's an incentive, that added incentive for people who already published in Science. And I wonder, what more incentive do you need to give to people who have already published in Science? It's like giving a Louis Vuitton bag to people who enter into a club that requires a dress code where you have only Gucci and Gabbana thing. You don't need it. In the sense that we need to somehow think about new forms of incentivizing, and really we talk about cosmetic changes. We have invented internet, and the best thing that we've used in the science publishing is open access and online submission. And so I think we need grassroots level changes that as somebody said, we should de-elitize science, not just the journal, but to allow everyone to publish, and journals like you, Science or Nature, should provide peer review service. And you could put a stamp that says that would be a Science 8.5 grade on 10 mark, for example. So the journal should be more like a peer review service and not selection of articles that should be published.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Joshua Wallach. I'm a PhD student with metrics. Tremendous respect for the entire panel, thank you. My kind of question and comment continues on about the whole incentive and also replication, and this could kind of assist with the whole peer review process, both at the journal level and externally. I'd like to hear kind of the thoughts from, now that we have a panel with editors and post-editors, about moving away from publishing only novel research and invitations to publish replication studies and to focus less on novel findings and more on replicating what is done, which could help with improving peer review.
Thank you. Metrics co-directors and students have a duty to be very, very brief.
So my question is mostly to Richard, but also other members of the panel, and it's something that also could be discussed in the breakout session. I think we need experimental studies on peer review processes. There's a little bit that has been done on the journal side, probably far less on the application and proposal side. What would be the ideal outcomes? So what do we want to study? And if we do see a benefit with some intervention, then we can say, this is good enough and we move forward. I mean, you showed the example of the science paper where the outcome was citations. And, I think it's a surrogate outcome. And downstream you said that, we don't use citations, but somehow, use citations as the gold standard to validate peer review. So there's some circularity unavoidably. What would be really the best outcomes? And how big an effect do we want to see to say, okay, we're abandoning what we do and we do something else now? Because if it's citations and, scores of reviews explain, like in that example, like 2% of the variance, I would say, peer review doesn't do anything or does very, very little. What is the outcome that we want and how big is the difference that we want to aim to change the system, if we are to change the system?
Okay, thank you. We have 3 questions left, so we'll take them all and then we'll have a final round where you can answer to all of these points. Thank you.
Steve Goodman and Metrics co-director. One observation from Jan Vandenbroek, he made it in his lecture, I think it was on the Lancet's 50th or 150th anniversary, I don't know which one, where he said that if we just published everything in repositories, what would happen is we would get a bunch of enterprising young scientists who would help sift through that and judge the quality of the articles and cluster them, and the journal system would be reborn in a different way. So I do think there are difficulties in imagining, as Dr. McNutt said, what would happen if we just put everything out there. But here are 2 focused questions. One, at the NIH, as we know from multiple studies going back to the 80s and more recently, and this is just in clinical trials, something like 30 to 40% of clinical trials, and this is not talking about other funded research, are not published in a timely fashion, maybe some not at all. Is there going to be some sort of formal system or checkbox in the NIH review system that checks whether anybody requesting funding has indeed published their prior work based on NIH funding? So that's the first question. The second, which dovetails on Doug's remark, is many of these methodologic errors persist in the scientific literature because, in fact, there are no methodologic experts, and I mean mainly quantitative experts, who review papers, and only the very top journals can afford statisticians or the relevant methodologists. And once you get below the very top tier, there's very little of that sort of expertise. What is the barrier there? I think a big barrier is money. Would it be of value to have a common fund from which journals can draw to pay for methodologic reviewers, and they have to pay for them and not people in their own field, because these same methodologic reviewers can be tapped for any science. They're not just reviewing their own science. So would there be a value of having a common fund for methodologic reviewers for more of the literature? And second, and first, will the NIH institute any check on the publication of prior research publication?
We'll have the last 2 questions, and let's all remember that the discussion will keep going, and we have the breakout session. So even if we don't get a chance to say everything now, we will have further opportunities.
Yeah, Eric Schortner with Oregon Health and Science University, and I guess what I have to say is perhaps more of a suggestion than a question, and it'll probably also maybe be more fitting in the small group, but it's about in the context of peer review. We've talked about blinding of authors. Names and reviewers' names and so on. And people have written about this, including myself, as a suggestion, but the idea of blinding, doing a results-free review, in other words, blinding reviewers to what the results of the study are, because that would remove some of the incentive that reviewers have and journals have to sort of upscore manuscripts based upon the significance of findings, which is going to impact the reproducibility. In other words, someone might submit a manuscript that is very solid in its science, but if it has a null p-value, it's not going to get the time of day in some of the in many of the big name journals. So I guess what I'm suggesting is more attention to the quality of the science as opposed to the quality, in quotes, of the results. And I think there's no way around this unless you deliberately blind the reviewers to the results.
Okay, thank you. Let's take the last comment or question.
I'm Jose Marino, I'm from the BMJ. People wanted to know some experience from journals that have gone to an open review. And we've been doing it for several years where authors know who reviewed the paper, the reviews are signed, and over the past year or so, we've actually posted the reviews, the response to the reviews, the changes to the manuscript, and so on, online alongside the paper. I think for us, it's been a very educational issue. We haven't had much problem in terms of getting reviewers. We think the reviews are actually positive and constructive. And one of the great values, I think, is that it's a great teaching tool for trainees to see how the process got along. But it's also, eventually, we would love to be able to have a system where people get recognition for their reviews. You spend several hours really teasing out a paper, making out what's in the paper, and it appears online. You can actually provide a citation. You don't just appear as a list of a name of someone thanking you for having done a review. You can show your review. We don't know if this is having a negative impact on reviewers' careers. Of course, that's something that's a concern, especially often junior people will say, how can I criticize the more senior people in the field? But it's something that so far has worked well for us. And just very briefly, and Doug may know about this, I don't know, I think that before this was implemented in the BMJ, there were some trials done where people were told their review was going to be public or not, or their author would know or not. And the editors didn't feel there was a difference in the quality of the review, so the idea was transparency was what really pushed us for that meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. We're running a little late with time, but we should have, I think, a final round. And again, take this opportunity to contact our speakers and keep the discussion going in later sessions as well. So, should we go in this order this time, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'll comment on just a little tidbit of a comment that came from our right side here that I think could be overlooked very quickly and shouldn't be. And that is that in randomized clinical trials, the first word is randomized. And that to say to a psychologist, how did you do the randomization? How did you do the random assignment to conditions? Would be insulting. It would be like saying, how did you put the toothpaste on the toothbrush in the morning? As if everybody knows how to do it. As it turns out, we pay $50,000, $60,000 to a survey research company to do a survey for us that involves random assignment of respondents to two conditions. And we have surprisingly often gotten the data back screaming they didn't do it randomly. And when we tell them they didn't do it randomly, they said, yes, we do. And we say, no, you didn't. And then they say, yes, we did. And then we say, no, you didn't. And then finally they say, oh, you're right, we didn't. It's so simple. But the only method I know of to do true randomization is to use the website random.org, which uses atmospheric noise as the basis for truly random numbers. That Excel claims it's randomizing, it's not. So much software is randomizing based on a seed that you can create bias, which it turns out these survey companies unwittingly do. And so if we are serious about eliminating these problems with replication, even such really basic things as that in procedures may actually help us. It may pay off. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to comment on a couple of the questions or comments. Training of peer reviewers, check. I think that's really important. This is something we're looking into and hope to be announcing something on that because I think it's important. The comment over here about my proposal being to do this only in science, no. Just like Brian's badges are something that any journal could do, that's what I was proposing. This is not something that's supposed to be science specific. So I'm sorry if I gave that impression. That's not what I was trying to do. The point about publishing replications and then that being directed at journals. I always worry when people say journals need to worry about this. Science published the replication of psychology. eLife is publishing the replication in cancer biology. Journals will publish replications. The real problem is culture in the research community. There has to be a culture that is willing to value replications when they are done and say to those who do them, yes, thank you for doing this. This was a value to the community. If that happens, then people will do them. Journals will publish them, but the culture has to change in the community. In terms of the comment over here about blinding to the result, if you read carefully the top standards, there are, for pre-registration of studies, of the analysis, there are 2 steps in that, where you can pre-register how you're going to do a study, and publish that, and then publish the study after you get the result. And that's a beautiful way to get your work published regardless of the result. So read the top standards.
Thank you.
There were a couple of comments. One was, am I talking about both sides of my mouth on the citation issue? I talk about the science paper that indicates there is a relationship between review scores and citations, just to indicate that there is no relationship. I really believe that the standard should be not whether or not you have more or less citations, but judging science requires a 10-year retrospective look. And I think that no matter how you slice up the science here, that the results have shown that the peer review process has resulted in a science establishment which is quite strong, and that, but it requires a certain level of support. And that's mainly what I'm arguing about. I don't think that citations themselves should ever be used in individual performance analysis of scientists. I constantly see the reaction, and I've used citations myself in arguing for a group. And the argument that always works with scientists is that our citations are high, but your citations are higher. People tend to believe measures that indicate that they are illustrious scientists. And however, when we apply this and say you will be scored based on the citations that you get or that you get published in science, it enormously corrupts science. So that's what I'm arguing against. NIH is looking at clinical trials and whether or not people are publishing in clinical trials, and they're leaving that in the hands of program staff rather than in review. And that's why clinical trials are now being taken out of fully scientist-initiated and required that clinical trials are in response to initiation from NIH. And at that point, program staff is supposed to look to see whether or not those individuals have been publishing the clinical trials they've done. That's all I'll comment on that.
Thank you very much. Professor Rennie for the final comment.
Well, once again, I think the comments I'm going to make are pretty useless and rather confusing, because the problem is that peer review is such a social and human event, and so many untoward things happen. It's a different set of editors deciding about this paper the second or third time it comes up. Stuff like that keeps happening, which makes our results built-in suspect and spurious, and there's English for you. And I don't know quite how we get our hands around this. On the left hand, I have the man who's just been mentioned, Jan van den Broeke from Leiden. And when I was in Leiden, he said, can you believe it? We have a professor of impact factor here. And I said, I can believe anything about impact factor and how it dominates everybody's lives. And of course, it's a consequence partly of what we're doing here. And then comes to stay a guy called Gene Garfield, staying at my home. He's been a good friend for years. And he said, for God's sake, Drummond, I invented this thing as a research tool in 1953, 55, and there is my thing. It's all there in science. And then a few years later, and a few years later. And he doesn't refer to the millions and millions and millions of bucks he made on it. But it is, all that he says is true. It's true. So he would say precisely what Jan van den Broeke said. It's a human process, it's messy, and people are actually basing how countries behave, let alone towns and universities and so on, behave on the basis of these assessments, these numbers, which are there only because they're convenient. I have to think of you as a number. I don't have to think of your pleasant qualities or the fact you didn't stand me the beer that I really feel. So we have to, I just say we have to remember this a lot. And I'm saying this may be a useless comment because I don't know how it helps the process. I would like a great deal more in the way of social science look into what goes on in peer review. But after reading Dan Kahneman and so on, I'm not sure if the methodologists there, I'm not sure, I don't know anything about this, have pulled their socks up enough. I mean, up to here, are they lederhosen, are they leotards? I just don't know. So I don't trust what comes out of that gang, but they say we are trustworthy.
Well, that was a fantastic, I think, conclusion. We are reconvening at 1 o'clock for lunch, and thank you very much all for the insightful comments.